Stephen, I think the most mysterious and interesting of all of the leaders of the ancient Egyptians was the man called Akhenaten. You wrote a landmark book where you write heavily about this person. Could you tell us from your perspective who was Akhenaten and why was he different from the other so-called pharaohs?
Well, it is a long story to condense, but it has been the subject of my life. I had an interest in Egypt when I was 8 years old, having a connection to the Sphinx and Great Pyramid, but it wasn't then that I decided that the study of Egypt or Egyptology would be my life. But the real turning point for me was in 1968. I had gone into the U.S. Air Force for 4 years during the Vietnam conflict and decided I wanted to read things that I did not have time for in college. And I'd always been a fan of Sigmund Freud. The last thing Sigmund Freud wrote was a series of articles for the psychoanalytic journal Imago in Vienna, Austria. 1934, he wrote an article postulating, was Moses an Egyptian priest? Was Moses an Egyptian? The reason why the leaders in Egyptology in that day were the Germans. So in 1846, Richard Lipsius, German Egyptologist, had discovered what we today call Amarna, a city that this particular king established away from other cities. It led to the discovery of this particular individual who had been lost to history up until that point, even to Egyptology, because his records had been erased. He took a title, Akhenaten. It's a long understanding to really develop what the title means. Ach means the shadow or the shade. Aten is a phase, the fourth phase of the stage of the sun. Aten, the wiser, shade or shadow of the wiser. Basically, this particular king decided to be a revolutionary, to change what was the pattern in what we call dynastic Egypt at the time. We're talking about 1350 BCE. He decided to break with the established religion at that time, which was called the religion of Amen, which is the last phase of the sun. We could go into great detail about the phases of the sun perhaps another time. But he wanted to return to the previous cycle, Aten, Iten, the full flowering of consciousness, where there were no priests, there were no religion, it was only pure spirituality. So he broke with that tradition and changed his title from Amenhotep, which he was born with, Amen is pleased, Amen is completed, the fulfillment of Amen, to Akhenaten. He left the city of Thebes, which is now Luxor, and built a whole city, which is called Akhenaten. We call it today Amarna, and lived there with several, his followers. It's a long story, but then to the point where I wrote the book From Light into Darkness. Freud had written other articles. If Moses was an Egyptian, he was a priest of this particular king, because it seemed like this particular king were what we call in Judaism Mosaic Judaism, the teachings that were given to Moses supposedly from Egypt. And Freud believed it came directly from this king. I believe Freud was right. This, to my opinion, is the greatest thing Freud gave to humanity, not his theory of psychoanalysis, not his theories of dreams, but of the story of this particular king. And so he wrote one more. He had to leave Germany because the Nazis were coming after him in 1939. He wrote one more essay. These three essays were incorporated in a book. The book is called Moses and Monotheism. It was published 6 months before Freud passed away, and he left this to humanity. It is obscure. Most scholars don't discuss it. I discovered it as a used paperback in 1968, and it changed my life. I became obsessed with this King Akhenaten. I wanted to find out everything about him, and the culmination was my book From Light into Darkness. I wrote with Abdel Hakim, with the oral indigenous Commission tradition of Akhenaten, that basically Akhenaten can be said not only to be directly influenced on Mosaic Judaism, but also the Rosicrucian teachings too. And so I brought those two together. And even in the indigenous elders here in Kemet, Akhenaten was venerated as a great master, a great enlightened being. In fact, there was an ascended master named, it'll come to me, that channeled through Alice Bailey, not Kutumi. It'll come to me. And he listed 34 Christs in the history of humanity. Said that Jesus had been number 34 and Akhenaten had been number 33. So some traditions look at Akhenaten as having Christ consciousness, being an enlightened being who tried to elevate the teachings here to go back to when they were before religion, when it was pure spirituality. But his revolution here in Kemet failed. The Amun priest gained power. They plotted behind his back. He might have been murdered. Nefertiti, his great wife, might have been murdered. His children may have been murdered. There's all sorts of speculation. And Tutankhamun, of course, followed him, may have been murdered. We can go into great detail for hours about this subject. But what happened is, we believe what is the Exodus in Judaism was the Amun priesthood coming back to power, chasing the followers of Akhenaten out of Egypt. They were not known as Hebrews per se then. Hebrews were in Kemet, and they were not known as Israelites, certainly not Jews. We call them the Seshuaten, the followers of Aten. They later became the Israelites and later became the incorporation into what is today Judaism. But also the Rosicrucians. The Rosicrucians considered Akhenaten the traditional Grand Master. I learned this when I got involved with the Rosicrucian order. They considered Akhenaten's great-grandfather, who we called Jehuti Misu III, Tutmosis III, as the founder of the Rosicrucian system. Akhenaten became the one who brought it. So he has these two traditions that I wrote about in From Light into Darkness, both from Judaism and from the Rosicrucian Western mystery schools, linked themselves to the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom of Egypt, Akhenaten.